music, jazz was his favorite. He played the drums and wanted more than anything to be able to make a living playing music. But he'd never really gotten that big break that he needed to push his career forward. So he was living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and working as a house painter. Tim was a drummer, and he had studied music at Berklee College in Boston. He was described by friends as being very laid back, just really a friendly guy. He was also very honest. In a 5-part series about Tim Wicks called Fatal Identity, Gina Barton wrote that Tim was the kind of guy you could leave alone in your house with a bunch of cash sitting out in plain sight and never have to worry about him touching it. He was just a good guy. By late 2001, it seemed like Tim's luck may be changing, as this opportunity of a lifetime, as he would describe it to his friends, kind of just fell in his lap. Tim told friends that he was going to move to Canada, where he had landed this music gig, and it paid $800 a week, which was more money than he had ever made playing drums. So he was super excited. This was exactly what he'd always dreamed of, being able to make money doing something that he loved. Now, Tim wasn't married, he wasn't dating, and he didn't have any children, so when this opportunity landed in his lap, there was no reason for him to stay in Milwaukee. It wasn't a decision he had to mull over. And while he was single, he wasn't unattractive. He did have the opportunity to date, but he kind of felt like women weren't really worth the hassle. Having a wife and kids would keep him tied down and unable to chase his dreams. On December 26th, 2001, Tim packed up and headed to Winnipeg, Canada. He was excited, but he also knew how the music scene was, so he had decided to hold on to his apartment for the time being, in case things didn't work out in Canada. He left an emergency number behind with his landlord in case something happened and she needed to get a hold of him. And he said goodbye to his friends and family, and he leaves. He had no way of knowing that he was about to walk into a trap that he would never make it out of alive. A week went by, and none of his friends had heard from him, which wasn't totally unexpected. They assumed that he was either just busy or getting settled. I mean, he did move to a different country. But then another week went by, and another, and no one had heard from Tim. And this was when people became concerned. While Tim's free spirit was great, and it made sense for him to be able to just pack up and move, it meant that no one was keeping close tabs on him because he was kind of a free spirit, never wanted to be tied down to anything or anyone. But he did have a really close group of friends that he did keep in pretty constant decided to call the Hills Corner Police Department. The problem was, none of his friends really knew the specifics of his new gig in Canada. None of them knew exactly where in Canada he was headed. They didn't know much other than he had left town with a friend of his named Dennis. A detective was assigned to the missing persons case, or possible missing persons case, and his name was Detective Schoonover. He would later tell Dateline that when this case was first handed to him, his impression was there wasn't actually a case at all. An adult has the right to move away and disappear if they want to. There were no signs of foul play, and it just didn't seem like much of a case at all. But Detective Schoonover was very wrong, and there was a case, and he would find out soon it involved friendship, betrayal, stolen identity, and murder. So the detective wasn't even really sure where to begin. Plus, he was working for a very small police department, so he didn't have a lot of the same resources that like a bigger police department might have. But according to court documents, Tim's brother did tell investigators that on Christmas Eve, he told him that he was going to Canada with his friend Dennis, where he would work as a jazz drummer. And for whatever reason, Dennis had wanted Tim to keep this job a secret. So Detective Schoonover went to Tim's apartment to start his investigation, and he spoke with the building manager. And she told the detective pretty much the same story that Tim's friends had already told police. He paid his rent for January, and on Christmas Day, he told the building manager that he was heading to Canada. She said that he seemed really excited. And she did have that phone number, the emergency number that Tim had left in case anything happened with his apartment. So she handed police this card, and written on it were the names Dennis, and then under that Tim Wicks, and then a phone number. So the detective calls the number, and when he did, a man answered the phone, and his name was Dennis Johnson. Dennis told the detective he didn't know anyone by the name of Tim Wicks, and this is super suspicious because Tim Wicks had literally given his number to his building manager. So of course the detective now is very suspicious of this Dennis. So he began looking into Dennis and found out that the name he had given, Dennis Johnson, was fake. And the address he had given the detective was also fake. So, now he is kind of starting to suspect something's off. So the detective goes back to Tim's apartment, and at this point, he's no longer just like crossing his T's and dotting his I's. He feels like something is off, and there may be a case here after all. So he begins looking through Tim's apartment, trying to look for any signs of foul play, but he couldn't find anything. So he began digging into Tim's life, and he found Tim's tax returns. And as he's going through them, he notices that they had been prepared by Lotus Financial, and a man specifically Dennis Gady. So when he sees the name Dennis Gady, he wonders if it's the same Dennis that Tim left town with. The same guy he had talked on the phone, who, for some reason, had given him a fake name. So he ran the name Dennis Gady through the system and found out that he had multiple warrants out for his arrest. At this point, Detective Schoonover called police in North Dakota, and he asked about a man out there who was going by the name of Dennis Johnson, living in the Fargo area. The detective didn't know anything about Dennis Johnson, the detective in Fargo. So Detective Schoonover is about to hang up, kind of defeated. And then he's like, wait a minute, what about the name Tim Wicks? Does that name sound familiar? And the officer on the other end did, in fact, know about Tim Wicks. And after a few more questions, the detective in North Dakota told Detective Schoonover that Tim Wicks wasn't actually a missing person. He was living in North Dakota, and the Bismarck police were actually investigating him for some illegal activities that Tim was involved in the area. The Bismarck police were looking into Tim Wicks, who was currently living in the Fargo area, because he was a suspect in an embezzlement case. The police said that Tim had embezzled about $10,000 from the company he was working for. He had written checks in his name for various amounts, and then he had cashed them to his bank account, which was also under the name Tim Wicks. Tim hadn't worked for the company for very long, but employees started to become very suspicious, and at one point one of them snapped a photo of Tim with their phone, and so police had this photo in their possession as part of their investigation. Now Detective Schoonover is a little confused because this doesn't sound like Tim Wicks. The Tim Wicks he's looking for is honest, laid back, a nice guy, and supposed to be in Canada drumming. So he asks this detective from North Dakota, what does Tim Wicks look like? Because the Tim Wicks who he was searching for, the missing Tim Wicks, was 6 feet tall, weighed about 185 pounds. He had wavy blondish hair with like a touch of gray and blue eyes. The Tim Wicks in North Dakota was overweight and balding. He was 6'3" and over 300 pounds, so there was no way that this was Tim Wicks. And it didn't take long before they realized the man calling himself Tim Wicks was actually Dennis Gady. Then, a few weeks after Dennis disappeared, in early January of 2002, a survey crew was out working near the Mamoni River when they found a torso. Now, the location of this torso is significant because it indicated to police that the killer was pretty smart. The body had been dumped in an area that was super close to the state line between Michigan's Upper Peninsula and northern Wisconsin. And this was a perfect way to stall the investigation because two different police departments would be trying to figure out whose jurisdiction the torso was found in. Plus, only the nearby states and towns, trying to match them with Tim Wicks. So as he read a description of the torso and the head found in Wisconsin, he knew he needed to get dental records for Tim Wicks. He also had no idea who Tim Wicks' dentist was. So he goes back to Tim's apartment, and he's looking for anything that can tell him who Tim's dentist was. But he actually didn't have to look very hard, because on the refrigerator was a little card that was like an appointment reminder card for a dental office. So he called there and was able to get Tim's x-rays. And soon it was confirmed that the body found in the river was that of Timothy Wicks. Once it was confirmed that Tim Wicks had been murdered, investigators began trying to put together a case on their only suspect, Dennis Gady. First, they had to figure out how Tim and Dennis even got mixed up together. They realized that Dennis was working as an accountant, and Tim had responded to an ad that Dennis had placed for doing your taxes for $25. So this was how Tim first made contact with Dennis, and they realized they had a lot in common. They were both drummers, so they became friends. Now, there isn't a ton of information on Dennis Gady. We do know that in 1987 he owned a garage in Milwaukee, and he was married, and he had 2 children. He made a bad investment in some car parts that turned out to be stolen. So then he worked with local authorities because some of his customers who were in a bike gang were the ones who had gotten him involved in this. So he worked with authorities to help catch them. And then he began working for police, and he got super interested in police work, and he began taking law enforcement classes. And then he was hired by the Marshfield Police Department in 1991 to work as an undercover officer, or to work undercover on drug cases. I'm not sure if he was an officer, but he was working undercover for the police department. But he somehow got into drugs and became addicted, and soon he was just making a mess of things. So the police department kind of parted ways with him, and he had to plead guilty to cocaine possession. He served 90 days in jail for this, and then his life just kind of started to spiral. He got divorced, he moved, and tried to start a restaurant, but he always seemed to be getting himself back into kind of the same situations, and he kept ending up with felony charges. He headed up to Winnipeg, Canada for a while in 1995, but a member of the biker gang who he his bridges as Luke Gannon, and he went back to the United States. He crossed the border in North Dakota and he stayed there. In 2001, he met a woman named Diane Frug, who was a hairstylist. She was a single mother and had really been through a string of bad relationships. She had a daughter and a son, and she totally fell in love with Dennis, and I guess he was really great with her kids too. So they married pretty quickly, and at the time they married, Diane didn't realize what a dark past Dennis had. But after they were married, he confessed to her that he had several warrants, like felony warrants, and he was like, look, I can't go back to jail, so we need to skip town. And she loves him, so she goes along with this. Now, she had 2 children, a daughter named Rachel, who was a teenager, so Rachel goes to live with her father when Dennis and Diane decide to skip town, but her son Joshua she kept with her and took him with them. According to Diane, Dennis told her that his friend Tim Wicks told him that he could use his identity, like he had permission. So she begins calling him Tim Wicks, and together as Tim Wicks, they buy a home together in this super small farming town called Gardner, North Carolina. And when I say small, like, there were only 85 people living in this town. Dennis got a job at a company called Compressed Air, and it didn't take long before employees began to notice the money was missing. Sometimes small amounts, other times larger checks. And then one day after Christmas, Dennis left for lunch, and he never came back. The company's owner began looking into the finances and realized Dennis, who was working under the name Tim Wicks, had been embellishing thousands of dollars. So he called the police to file a report. Around the time that this happened, that Dennis's employer was becoming suspicious of him, he gets a call from his friend, the real Tim Wicks. Now Tim has no idea that Dennis is using his identity. There are credit cards in his name that he didn't apply for. So he calls his friend because he's super bummed about it and he just wants to talk to his friend. He has no idea it's Dennis who's stealing his identity. On January 23rd, 2002, after Tim's body was discovered, police issue a search warrant for Dennis's home. Inside, they sprayed luminol all over, and the kitchen lit up like a Christmas tree. So, at one point, this entire kitchen had been covered in blood. They also found dig marks in the frozen soil outside the home. They said it was like if someone was trying to dig into the ground with a backhoe. But it's January in North Dakota, so the ground was frozen solid. So it was impossible to do. At this point, police knew they needed to track down Dennis and Diane. So, while the search for the couple was underway, investigators are also looking into Tim Wicks' finances. And they find out that all of his accounts had been completely cleaned out. There was nothing left in any of them. They also found out that after Tim had been killed, someone had gone into the bank, said that he was Tim Wicks, and pulled out all of the money. Dennis had been the person who had done Tim's taxes in the past. He had access to Tim's social security number, his mother's maiden name, anything that he would need to empty out Tim's accounts. And Tim's credit cards were being used, and police were hoping that these credit cards would lead them to Dennis, because they could track where they were being used. On January 30th, 2002, an arrest warrant was issued for Dennis' arrest for identity theft. They didn't have enough to charge him with murder yet, but they wanted him in custody. Diane also had a warrant for her arrest, which was tied to her child custody agreement, which said she could not take her son Joshua out of the state of North Dakota, which she had. In the meantime, Dennis and Diane are driving around in an RV they had bought with the money they had taken out of Tim's accounts. But police eventually tracked them down in March of 2002 in Lincoln, Nebraska. Dennis was taken into custody, and they didn't have enough at that point to charge him with murder, but they charged him with embezzlement and insurance fraud because he'd been getting insurance benefits under the name Tim Wicks. But police wanted to get him behind bars, so he couldn't take off and disappear while they were building their case against him for Tim's murder. Dennis told police that Tim had told him he could use his identity. So he ended up pleading guilty, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison on the embezzlement charges. But he maintained he had nothing to do with Tim's murder, and unfortunately police had zero evidence. Diane served 6 months in prison on her charges. Police's only plan really was to try to appeal to Diane to come clean. They kept going back to her and trying to talk to her and getting her to tell the truth, but she was in love with Dennis, stupidly, blindly in love and loyal to this man. But they knew she was their only chance of getting him on murder. So they kept going back to her again and again and again. And finally, Diane was ready to talk. But what she said wasn't what police were hoping for. Diane told police that Tim had sexually assaulted her, and she had killed him in self-defense. Now, no one believed the story, and it was clear to investigators that Dennis was totally manipulating Diane, even while they were both still behind bars. Investigators theorized that Dennis had told Diane that if she said she was the one who did it, but that it was self-defense, that they wouldn't put her in prison for self-defense. But police knew Dennis was the only one who had a motive to kill Tim Wicks. And then police got a big break from a very unexpected person. 4-year-old Joshua, Diane's son. Now, he had been in therapy since his mom was put in prison, and it had come out in therapy that Dennis had shot Tim. He knew this. He was there. So in November of 2002, Diane was released from jail. In February of 2004, so 2 years later, police had this interview with Diane, and this one was different because at this point, the FBI was involved. And in that interview, Diane comes clean. She tells police what actually happened. She said that around December 25th, and suspect that it might be Dennis. But this call was really what got the ball rolling. Dennis hung up the phone and said, "Tim has to die." Then he comes up with a plan. He invited Tim to his house so they could prep for this made-up music gig, because he knew he could get Tim to go wherever if he said that he had like a music gig. Diane would later testify in court that Dennis had told her that he might have to kill Tim. So on December 26th, Dennis went to Milwaukee, picked up Tim, and they drove back to Gardner, North Dakota. She said around 8 p.m. that evening she went upstairs to put Joshua to bed, and they were just downstairs, drinking and smoking pot. She said she heard a noise, and she went downstairs to see what it was. So she hears this noise. She didn't know what it was, so she went downstairs, and she saw Tim lying on the kitchen floor. Diane said at first she thought he had just passed out, but Dennis said, "I shot him." She said she stood there and watched as Dennis put a plastic bag over Tim's head to suffocate him. She then helped drag the body out to the shed, where they left it to freeze. And then she helped Dennis clean up the mess. They then used Tim's credit card to rent a backhoe because he was going to try and bury the body in the backyard. But they couldn't dig in the frozen ground. So they put the body into a truck, along with her child, Joshua, and they took him into the woods. Dennis then cut up the body, wanting to get rid of the hands and head to make it impossible for the remains to be identified. Dennis said they had to kill him because they had built this nice little life together, and if Tim or anyone realized that Dennis had been stealing from him and using his identity, their perfect new life would come crashing down. With Diane's story, they were able to pull CCTV footage from the different places that she had claimed they had gone to carry out the murder, and get the supplies needed. And they were seen on this footage. This was exactly what police needed. They now had enough evidence to bring murder charges for the murder of Tim Wicks. Dennis pled not guilty, and his trial began in April of 2006. Diane would testify against him in court, and Dennis's defense tried to pin the murder on Diane. But the jury didn't buy it, and Dennis was found guilty of the murder. And in June of 2006, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Diane filed for divorce from Dennis after he was convicted of murder. He is still behind bars, but Diane died in 2012 at the age of 46. And that is the murder of Tim Wicks. I just quickly want to cite my sources for this video because there was this amazing 5-part series written by Gina Barton for the Journal Centennial